The transport truck lurched to a halt, and Greta Hoffman's stomach twisted with dread. Through the canvas flaps she could see nothing but blinding Arizona sunlight and dust particles dancing in the air like tiny specks of gold. This was it. America, the enemy's homeland. The land she had been taught to fear and despise. She braced herself for what the propaganda films had promised. Starvation, brutality, torture chambers, perhaps execution by firing squad. Beside her, young Anna Fisher was trembling like a leaf in winter wind, tears streaming silently down her dirt-streaked face, leaving clean trails through the grime of 3 weeks' travel. Liesel Weber gripped the wooden bench so hard her knuckles had turned bone white, her breathing shallow and rapid. Hilda Schneider sat rigid as a statue, her teacher's mind cataloging every sound, every smell, every sensation, preparing for the worst while hoping desperately for something better. When the tailgate dropped open with a metallic clang that echoed like a death knell, Greta closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her as a child, words about protection and mercy that seemed hollow now in this foreign desert. The journey to this moment had begun 3 weeks earlier, in the chaos of the Allied advance through France. Greta had been stationed at a field hospital near Normandy, tending to wounded soldiers as the front collapsed around them like a house of cards. The shelling had been constant, a thunderous backdrop to the screams of dying men, the smell of blood and antiseptic and fear creating a stench that she would never forget. She had worked 20-hour shifts, her hands steady even as her mind reeled from the carnage. Boys, so many boys, missing limbs and bleeding out on tables that never stayed empty for long. The doctors shouting orders, the nurses running with supplies that dwindled by the hour, the certainty that they were losing not just battles, but the entire war. When American forces overran their position on a gray morning in late March, she had expected immediate retribution. The propaganda had been clear. American soldiers were criminals, rapists, murderers who showed no mercy to the defeated. She had hidden in a supply closet with 2 other nurses, listening to boots stomping through the hospital, voices shouting in English, the occasional burst of gunfire. When the door was finally yanked open, she had squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the bullet. Instead, a young GI with freckles and a Midwestern accent had offered her a canteen of water, his expression more curious than cruel. She'd been too terrified to drink it, certain it was poisoned. He had shrugged and moved on, leaving her more confused than afraid. Was this a trick? A game before the real horror began? The processing center in England had been her first real contact with American forces as a prisoner. She had been transported there with dozens of other captured medical personnel, packed into the back of trucks like cattle. The soldiers there had been businesslike, but not cruel. They had asked questions through interpreters, filled out endless forms with carbon paper creating duplicate copies, and given the prisoners thin soup and hard bread. It was barely enough to survive on, leaving her stomach cramping with hunger, but it was more than Greta had expected. The propaganda minister's voice echoed in her memory, warning of American savagery, of torture chambers where prisoners were beaten for sport, of mass graves dug for those who resisted. Yet here she was, still breathing, still whole, still being treated with a cold professionalism that was almost more frightening than outright brutality would have been. Liesel, captured in Berlin during the final Soviet push westward, had arrived at the same processing center with horror stories of the Eastern Front. She spoke little of what she had seen during those final terrible days, but her eyes held a darkness that needed no words. The first night they shared a barrack, Greta had woken to find Liesel sitting upright on her cot, staring at nothing, silent tears streaming down her face. When Greta had tried to comfort her, Liesel had flinched away violently, then apologized in a broken whisper. The Russians, she had said simply, and Greta had understood. Some things were too terrible to speak aloud. The Atlantic crossing had been miserable beyond description. Packed into the hold of a Liberty ship with 300 other prisoners, the women had endured 2 weeks of seasickness, fear, and uncertainty. The ship rolled constantly in the rough spring seas, and the sound of retching became a constant background noise. The hold smelled of vomit, sweat, and despair. The American sailors had kept their distance, neither friendly nor hostile, maintaining a professional boundary that the prisoners couldn't quite interpret. Food had been minimal, crackers that crumbled into dust, canned meat that tasted like salted cardboard, and water that tasted of rust and chemicals. The toilet facilities consisted of buckets that sloshed with the ship's movement, creating a humiliating and nauseating situation. At night, in the darkness broken only by a few dim bulbs that swung with the ship's motion, the women had whispered among themselves, sharing rumors and fears. Some said the Americans would use them as slave labor in factories, working them to death in munitions plants. Others believed they would be handed over to angry mobs for revenge, lynched by families who had lost sons in Europe. A few optimists suggested they might be exchanged for American prisoners, sent back to whatever remained of Germany. Anna, barely out of her teens and looking even younger in her terror, had cried herself to sleep most nights, calling out for her mother in Munich, begging to go home to a city that likely no longer existed. Hilda had tried to maintain order among the group, her teaching instincts kicking in even in captivity. She had organized them into watches to prevent theft of their meager possessions, made sure everyone got their fair share of rations when distribution was chaotic, and kept spirits up with quiet songs when the guards weren't listening. German folk songs, mostly. Melodies from childhood that reminded them of better times. But even Hilda's iron composure had cracked when they docked in New York Harbor. Through a small porthole, Greta had caught a glimpse of the city. Massive buildings reaching toward the sky like mountains of steel and glass. Lights blazing despite the war when Germany had been dark for years. Cars and trucks moving in endless streams of abundance. It was a vision of wealth and power that contradicted everything they had been told about America. The Führer had promised them that the United States was on the verge of collapse, its mongrel population starving and desperate, its economy shattered, its military incompetent. What Greta had seen from that porthole told a different story entirely. This was a nation untouched by bombing, unburdened by years of total war, operating at a level of industrial capacity that Germany could never have matched even at its height. The realization had been like ice water in her veins. They had been lied to, about everything. If the Americans were this strong, this prosperous, how had Germany ever thought it could win? The train ride across America had been equally disorienting. For 3 days they had traveled through landscapes that seemed impossible to a European eye. Endless farmlands heavy with crops stretching to every horizon. Towns untouched by bombing with neat houses and paved streets. Factories running at full capacity with smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. There were no ruins, no burned-out buildings, no evidence of the total war that had consumed Europe and left it in ashes. The American heartland was thriving, its people well-fed, and going about their lives as if the conflict was happening on another planet. Which, in a way, it was. Greta had pressed her face against the train window like a child, watching children playing baseball in schoolyards, women shopping in stores with full shelves and colorful displays, men driving new automobiles that gleamed in the sunlight. Each mile had been another nail in the coffin of everything she had believed, another piece of evidence that the war had been built on lies from the very beginning. Now standing at the tailgate of the truck under the merciless Arizona sun that felt like it was trying to burn through her skull, Greta forced herself to open her eyes. A woman in an American uniform stood before them, her expression neutral but not unkind. She was perhaps 40, with brown hair pinned neatly under her cap and a clipboard in her hands. Her uniform was crisp and clean, her posture military straight, but not aggressive. Captain Dorothy Sullivan, though Greta wouldn't learn her name until later, surveyed the frightened German women with the practiced eye of someone who had done this many times before and knew exactly what they were feeling. "Welcome to Camp Florence," the captain said in accented but clear German, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. You will be expected to follow camp rules and work assignments. Do you understand?" The words sounded rehearsed, official, and completely unbelievable. Greta glanced at Hilda, who raised one skeptical eyebrow in a gesture that spoke volumes. This had to be a trick, some elaborate psychological torture before the real punishment began. They would lull the prisoners into a false sense of security, then spring the trap. Anna was still crying softly, her shoulders shaking. Liesel's face had gone pale as chalk, her lips moving in silent prayer to a god who seemed to have abandoned Europe years ago. "Please exit the vehicle and form a line," Captain Sullivan continued. gesturing toward a pathway leading into the camp with her clipboard. Your belongings will be searched and you will be assigned to your barracks. Medical examinations will be conducted tomorrow morning. Anyone with urgent medical needs should identify themselves now. Slowly, hesitantly, like animals emerging from a trap, the women climbed down from the truck. Greta's legs were stiff from hours of travel, muscles cramping from sitting in the same position, and she nearly stumbled on the last step. A hand shot out to steady her, and she flinched violently, expecting a blow. In the camp she had heard about, guards beat prisoners for the smallest infractions, real or imagined. But the hand belonged to Sergeant James Mitchell, a tall man with sandy hair and tired eyes that held some deep sadness, and his grip was firm but not painful. He let go immediately when he saw her fear, stepping back with his hands raised slightly, palms out, as if dealing with a spooked horse that might bolt. "Easy there," he said quietly in English. "Watch your step." Greta stared at him, uncomprehending. In the camp she had heard whispered about, the camps where political prisoners and others disappeared, guards beat prisoners for sport. This man had helped her. Why? What was his angle? What did he want? She hurried to join the other women in line, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. The camp itself was nothing like she had imagined. There were rows of wooden barracks, neat and orderly, surrounded by double fencing topped with coils of barbed wire that gleamed in the sunlight. But the buildings looked sturdy and new, with fresh paint and solid construction, not the disease-ridden hovels she had expected. There were gardens between some of the structures, with vegetables growing in organized plots that someone was clearly tending with care. Tomatoes on stakes, rows of lettuce, beans climbing trellises. In the distance, she could see what looked like a recreation area with tables and benches under shade structures. A few male prisoners, also German by their uniforms, were playing a game with a ball, some kind of sport she didn't recognize. They were laughing, actually laughing, the sound carrying across the compound like something from another world. "This has to be for show," Hilda muttered beside Greta, her voice low and suspicious. "They want us to let our guard down. It's psychological warfare. Make us comfortable, then extract information or use us for propaganda." "But why?" Liesel whispered back, her voice trembling. "What purpose would that serve? What information could we possibly have that would be valuable? We're just nurses and factory workers." Hilda had no answer to that, which seemed to disturb her more than any explicit threat might have. The processing building was cool inside, a relief from the desert heat that had been baking them alive. The women were led into a large room where several American soldiers, both male and female, waited with more clipboards and forms and typewriters. One by one, each prisoner was called forward to have her information recorded with meticulous attention to detail. Name, rank, unit, hometown, next of kin. The Americans wrote everything down with methodical precision, creating files that would follow each prisoner through the system. When it was Greta's turn, she approached the desk with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The soldier behind the desk was a young woman, perhaps 25, with red hair pulled back in a bun and freckles across her nose that made her look wholesome and trustworthy. She smiled slightly when Greta sat down, a gesture so unexpected that Greta could only stare in confusion. "Name?" the woman asked in German, her accent distinctly American but her vocabulary solid and her grammar mostly correct. "Greta Hoffman." The woman wrote it down with careful letters. "Rank?" "Sanitätsgefreiter, medical corporal." The woman nodded, making a note in the margin. "You're a nurse?" "Yes." 3 years training? 2 years field service? "Good. We can always use medical personnel. You'll probably be assigned to the camp infirmary once you're settled in, and we've verified your credentials." Greta blinked, certain she had misunderstood. Assigned to the infirmary? To work as a nurse? Not to dig ditches in the desert or break rocks in a quarry? The confusion must have shown plainly on her face because the woman's smile widened slightly, becoming more genuine. "We follow the Geneva Convention here," the woman said, her tone matter-of-fact as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Medical personnel are treated according to their profession. You'll assist our doctors with prisoner care. It's still work, but it's appropriate work." "I don't understand," Greta said slowly, struggling to process this information. "Why would you trust us to provide medical care? We could sabotage treatments, harm patients." The woman's expression became more serious. "You could, but we don't think you will. And you'll be supervised, at least initially. We're not naive, Miss Hoffman. We're just trying to be decent. The interrogation, if it could be called that, continued for several more minutes. The questions were practical, not invasive. Any medical conditions we should know about? Any medications you were taking? Any injuries that need immediate attention? No one threatened her. No one raised their voice. No one demanded she renounce her government or sign propaganda statements. When it was over, Greta was handed a small bundle, 2 sets of clothing in plain gray fabric, a blanket that was thin but clean, a towel that was rough but functional, a bar of soap, and a toothbrush with actual bristles. She stared at the items in bewilderment, turning the soap over in her hands. Real soap. Not the ersatz chemical blocks they had used in Germany for the last 2 years, made from God knew what ingredients and barely producing any lather. This was actual soap that smelled faintly of lavender and felt smooth against her skin. The barracks assigned to the women was at the eastern edge of the camp, separate from the male prisoners for obvious reasons of propriety. It was a long wooden structure with windows that actually had glass in them, not just boards or paper or nothing at all. Inside, there were rows of metal cots arranged in neat lines, each with a thin mattress and a pillow. It wasn't luxury by any means, but it was clean. The floor had been swept recently and there was no dust or debris. There were no rats, no insects visible, no overwhelming stench of human misery and waste. At the far end of the building, there were actual bathroom facilities, toilets that flushed, sinks with running water, and showers with heads that looked functional. This can't be real, Anna whispered, clutching her bundle of supplies like a lifeline, like they might be taken away at any moment. It's too good. They're going to take it away. This is some kind of test. Hilda moved through the space with the air of a general inspecting troops before battle, her eyes missing nothing. She checked under cots for signs of vermin, examined the walls for structural damage, tested the water in the sinks to make sure it was actually clean and not some trick. Everything worked. Everything was functional. The toilets flushed properly. The water ran clear. The windows opened to let in air. She returned to the group with a perplexed expression that was almost comical on her usually confident face. I don't know what game they're playing, she admitted, her voice low and troubled. But for now, we should accept what they're giving us. Stay alert. Trust nothing and no one. Watch everything. Report anything suspicious to the group. The women chose cots near each other, a small cluster of familiarity in a strange land, the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Greta sat on her mattress and pressed down experimentally. It was thin but better than sleeping on bare ground, which is what she had done for the last month during the chaos of retreat and capture. Liesel lay down immediately, curling into a fetal position, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her fear. Anna sat on the edge of her cot, still crying quietly, her face buried in her hands. A bell rang somewhere outside, a clear metallic tone, and moments later Captain Sullivan appeared in the doorway like she had been waiting for that exact moment. Dinner is in 30 minutes, she announced in that same careful German. You'll eat in the mess hall with the other prisoners. Form a line outside when you hear the second bell. Follow the other prisoners. They'll show you the way. Then she was gone, leaving the women to process this new information. Dinner. They were going to be fed. Greta's stomach, which had been clenched in fear for so long, suddenly reminded her that she was starving. When had she last eaten? A piece of stale bread that morning? No, that had been yesterday morning. Time had become fluid in her exhaustion, days blending together into one long nightmare. The mess hall was another shock to the system that left Greta reeling. It was a large building filled with long tables and benches, already occupied by male German prisoners who looked up with curiosity and surprise when the women entered. Many of them hadn't seen German women in months or years. The room fell silent for a moment, then gradually conversation resumed in German with various regional accents. The women were directed to a serving line where American cooks, prisoners themselves based on their uniforms bearing the PW marking, stood behind steaming trays of food that sent incredible smells wafting through the air. Greta could smell it before she saw it. Meat, real meat that wasn't mystery cans or questionable sausage and potatoes and vegetables. Her mouth watered involuntarily, saliva flooding in a response she couldn't control. When she reached the front of the line, a large man with a ladle and a friendly face filled her tray with pork chops that were actually thick and properly cooked. mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans that looked fresh, and a piece of bread with actual butter, yellow and creamy. A cup of milk was placed next to her tray. Milk. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen fresh milk. In Germany, they'd been drinking ersatz coffee made from acorns and chicory for years. Is this all for me?" she asked in German, certain there had been a mistake, that this was meant for multiple people to share. The cook, an older prisoner who looked like he might have been a farmer before the war, with weathered skin and strong hands, grinned broadly. "Every day, Schwester. Every single day. The Americans, they feed us like kings. I've gained 10 kilos since I arrived 2 months ago. Look at me. I'm fat again." Greta carried her tray to a table where Hilda, Liesel, and Anna had already sat down, their faces reflecting the same shock and disbelief. They all stared at their food with identical expressions of wonder and suspicion. "I'm not eating it," Hilda declared firmly. "It's drugged or poisoned. They're trying to make us compliant or kill us slowly." Liesel picked up her fork uncertainly, turning it over in her hands. "Then why are all these men still alive? Look at them. They're healthy, well-fed. Some of them are actually overweight. You can't fake that." "It's a trick," Hilda insisted. But her conviction was wavering as she looked around at the undeniably healthy prisoners eating with obvious enjoyment. Anna, driven by hunger that overpowered her fear, hunger that gnawed at her belly like a living thing, cut a small piece of pork and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes widening as the flavor registered. Then she took another bite, and another. Her hands began to shake. "It's real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears. "Oh God, it's real food. Actual food." That broke the dam. All 4 women began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency born of months of deprivation. The food was simple but plentiful and cooked well. The pork was tender and seasoned with something that tasted like sage. The potatoes were creamy and rich with butter. The green beans were seasoned with something that tasted like bacon. Greta had to force herself to slow down, knowing that her shrunken stomach couldn't handle too much after weeks of near-starvation rations. Around them, other prisoners ate with the casual confidence of people who knew there would be another meal tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. A young German soldier at the next table, no more than 20 with a face that still had some boyishness to it, leaned over with a sympathetic expression. "First day?" Greta nodded, unable to speak with her mouth full, suddenly remembering her manners and feeling embarrassed. "It takes time to believe it," the soldier said sympathetically, his voice kind. "I've been here 4 months, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm dreaming. The Americans, they're not what we were told. They follow their rules. Geneva Convention, they call it. They're obsessed with their rules. We get 3 meals a day like this, medical care if we're sick or injured, letters from home if mail can get through the lines. We work, yes, but we're paid in camp script that we can use at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, newspapers, even books. It's not freedom, but it's not hell either. It's just strange." "What kind of work?" Hilda asked sharply, her suspicion still active even while eating. The soldier shrugged, gesturing with his fork. "Farm work mostly. Arizona is agricultural. Picking cotton, harvesting vegetables, working in the citrus groves. The local farmers pay the government for our labor, and we get a small portion in scrip. Some men work in the camp itself, cooking, maintenance, construction. The Americans are building more barracks. They say more prisoners are coming every week now that the war is ending." "Is it?" Liesel asked quietly. "Ending, I mean." The soldier's expression darkened. "From what we hear, yes. Germany is finished. The Russians are in Berlin. The Americans and British are everywhere. It's over. We just haven't officially surrendered yet." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication and loss. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, everything they had sacrificed, all of it was ending in defeat. The 1,000-year Reich would last barely more than a decade. The silence at their table was profound. After dinner, the women were led back to their barracks as the desert sky turned purple and orange with sunset, colors so vivid they seemed painted. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the heat of the day giving way to surprising cold that made Greta shiver. Deserts, she was learning, were places of extremes. Greta wrapped herself in her blanket and lay on her cot, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. Around her, the other women were having similar quiet crises of belief and identity. "I don't understand," Liesel said into the darkness after the lights had been turned low. "Why are they being kind to us? We're the enemy. We killed their soldiers. Our bombs destroyed their ships. Why aren't they taking revenge?" "Maybe that's the point," Hilda replied thoughtfully, her analytical mind working on the problem. "Maybe they want to prove they're better than us, than what we became. Better than what the Reich did." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication and things unspoken. Greta thought about the camps she had heard whispers of in Germany, the places where people disappeared and never returned. Political prisoners, Jews, communists, homosexuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the regime. She had told herself it was propaganda, enemy lies designed to weaken German morale and turn the population against their leaders. But what if it wasn't? What if every terrible rumor was true or even understated? What if the Americans were showing them what humanity looked like precisely because they knew what inhumanity Germany had practiced? The next morning brought more surprises that continued to challenge everything they had been taught. They were awakened at 6 by a bell, given time to wash and dress in their new clothing, then led to breakfast. Oatmeal with actual sugar, toast with jam that was sweet and fruity, coffee that was real coffee and not ersatz substitutes, and fruit, real fruit, apples and oranges that looked like they had been picked recently, not the withered things they'd seen in German markets for years. After breakfast, medical examinations. The camp doctor, an American major with gray hair and gentle hands that moved with practiced competence, examined each woman with professional detachment. He noted their malnutrition, their various injuries and ailments, and prescribed treatments with the same care he would give to American soldiers. When it was Greta's turn, she undressed behind a screen with shaking hands while a female nurse stood by. The major examined her thoroughly but without any inappropriate behavior, checking her eyes, ears, throat, listening to her heart and lungs, palpating her abdomen for abnormalities. He noted the scars on her hands from field surgery work, the poorly healed burn on her left arm from a cooking accident during the retreat. "You're malnourished but otherwise healthy," he said through a translator. "We'll get you on proper nutrition and vitamins. That burn wasn't treated properly. We'll clean it and rebandage it." Greta was asked questions about her training. She answered honestly, too tired for deception. 3 years at nursing school in Hamburg, 2 years field service with the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, experience with surgery, trauma care, infectious disease. The major nodded and made notes. "You'll start in the infirmary tomorrow," the major told her through the translator. "We have several German doctors on staff already, but we can always use another good nurse. You'll be working with American medical personnel as well. Can you handle that?" Greta nodded, still processing the fact that she was being asked, not ordered. "Good. Report at 0700 hours tomorrow morning. You'll be issued proper medical attire." The rest of the day was spent orienting to camp life. Captain Sullivan gave them a tour, explaining the rules and expectations. Lights out at 10, roll call twice daily, work assignments posted weekly. Letters could be sent and received, subject to censorship. The camp had a library, a chapel, even a small theater where prisoners put on shows. There were sports leagues, language classes, and hobby workshops. It was surreal, a pocket of normalcy in the midst of a world war. But it was Sergeant Mitchell who provided insight into the American perspective. Greta encountered him that afternoon near the infirmary. He was leaning against a fence, smoking a cigarette, his expression distant. "Sergeant," she said hesitantly in her limited English, "can I ask question?" He turned, surprised. "Sure. Why, you are kind. To us? We are enemy." Mitchell took a long drag on his cigarette. "My brother died in France," he said finally. "Killed by German soldiers. Machine gun nest near St. Lo. He was 19 years old. I have every reason to hate you people." Greta waited, sensing there was more. "But hatred doesn't end wars," Mitchell continued. "It just makes more wars. My father fought in the last war, the Great War, the war to end all wars. That was a joke. We treat you right because that's what separates us from the monsters. We follow the rules because that's who we want to be, not because of who you are." The words were simple but profound. The Americans weren't being kind out of weakness. They were being kind as an act of will and principle. "Your brother," she said slowly. "I am sorry, very sorry." Mitchell nodded. "Yeah, me too." Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Work in the infirmary, where Greta treated American soldiers and German prisoners with equal care under Major Reynolds's supervision. Meals that continued to be abundant. Evenings in the barracks where the women slowly relaxed their guard. Letters were distributed one afternoon. Anna received word that her family had survived Munich. Liesel learned her brother was alive in a Russian POW camp. Hilda got nothing. Her family had been in Berlin when it fell. The work was hard but not brutal. Greta spent days changing bandages, administering medications, assisting with surgeries. The American medical personnel treated her with professional courtesy, teaching her new techniques. Major Reynolds was particularly respectful, valuing her field experience. It was strange to work alongside the enemy, but the walls gradually lowered. Medicine was a universal language. One evening, Greta found herself alone with Captain Sullivan in the infirmary office. "Can I ask you something?" Sullivan said suddenly in German. Greta nodded. "What did they tell you about us? About America?" Greta hesitated, then chose honesty. "They told us you were weak, racially impure, controlled by Jews and criminals. They said your soldiers were cowards. They said if we lost, you would torture us, rape us, kill us without mercy." Sullivan's expression was carefully neutral. "And now I think they lied about everything. Your soldiers fight hard. Your country is strong. And you treat us better than we treated our own people toward the end." The captain nodded slowly. "We're not perfect. We have our own sins. But we try to follow certain principles. Human dignity, rule of law, the belief that even enemies deserve basic rights. It doesn't always work out the way we hope, but we try." Anna was the first to truly embrace their new reality. Young and resilient, she threw herself into camp life. She learned English from the guards, joined a choir, and helped in the camp kitchen. Watching her, Greta felt bittersweet emotions. This girl should have been in university, not imprisoned in a desert. Liesel found work in the camp library organizing books. In the quiet spaces between shelves, she slowly processed the trauma of Berlin's fall. The library became her sanctuary. Hilda was the last holdout maintaining her skepticism, but even she couldn't deny the evidence. The food kept coming. No one was tortured. Her transformation came when she was assigned to teach English. Standing in front of a classroom again, she found a piece of herself the war had stolen. When Captain Sullivan praised her teaching, Hilda actually smiled. Sergeant Mitchell's journey ran parallel to theirs. One day, Greta approached him deliberately. "Your brother," she said carefully. "I am sorry." Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah, me too. I wanted to hate you. All of you. It would have been easier. But you're just people. Scared, tired people who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves. Maybe we all just people," Greta offered. "Maybe war make monsters of everyone. Maybe. But we get to choose what we do after. That's what matters." As weeks turned into months, life developed a rhythm. News filtered in. Germany retreating on all fronts. Cities falling. The end approaching. The truth about the concentration camps reached them in fragments. Whispered conversations, newspaper articles, photographs. At first, many prisoners refused to believe it. Propaganda, they insisted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Greta remembered the whispers she had dismissed. Now she understood why the Americans treated them with such careful correctness. They were proving a point. The shame was crushing. Not all felt it equally. Some maintained their Nazi convictions, but most, confronted with the evidence, struggled with profound moral reckoning. Greta thought about the soldiers she had known. How many had known? How many had participated? In May, the war in Europe ended. The announcement came over the loudspeakers. The reaction was muted. Just exhaustion and uncertainty. Captain Sullivan spoke at an assembly. "The war is over, but you will remain prisoners until arrangements can be made for repatriation. This may take months or even years. We ask for your patience. You have behaved well here, and we will continue to treat you in accordance with the Geneva Convention." That night, the barracks was filled with quiet weeping. Greta lay awake, thinking about her family in Hamburg. Were they alive? She had received no letters in months. But life continued. The camp remained open, its population swelling. These new arrivals went through the same shock. Greta found herself explaining, reassuring, helping them adjust. She discovered a new purpose. She couldn't change the past, but she could help others navigate the present. The infirmary work expanded. Greta worked long hours, her skills invaluable. Major Reynolds began consulting her on difficult cases. It was respect earned through competence. One afternoon, nearly a year after her arrival, Greta saw a high-ranking SS officer being processed. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw recognition and fear. He knew what was coming. Unlike regular Wehrmacht soldiers, men like him would face trial, judgment, perhaps execution. The Americans made distinctions. Greta turned away, feeling grim satisfaction. Justice would not be perfect. Many guilty would escape, many innocent would suffer, but at least there would be an accounting. As months passed, she learned more English, read American newspapers, began to understand this strange country. She learned about American democracy, messy but functional. She learned about American diversity. She learned about American idealism. And she learned that propaganda works in both directions. When the letter finally came from her mother, nearly 18 months after her capture, Greta wept. Her family had survived. Hamburg was ruins, but they were alive. Her mother asked when she could come home. Greta had no answer, but knowing her family was alive gave her something to hold on to. In the infirmary one afternoon, Major Reynolds called her into his office. "Miss Hoffman, your work here has been exemplary. When repatriation begins, I'll be writing you a letter of recommendation. Germany will need good nurses to rebuild." Greta felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you, sir." That evening she stood at the fence watching the Arizona sunset. Sergeant Mitchell approached. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Yes, very beautiful. What will you do when you go home?" "I will nurse. Help rebuild. Try to make something good from all this terrible." Mitchell nodded. "That's all any of us can do." They stood in companionable silence, two people from opposite sides of a terrible war, watching the same sunset, hoping for the same things. Peace, healing, a chance to build something better. The war had shown humanity at its worst. But here, in this desert camp, Greta had also seen humanity at its best. Compassion for enemies, adherence to principles, the choice to be decent when no one would have blamed them for cruelty. When the time finally came for repatriation in late 1946, Greta said goodbye to people she never expected to call friends. Captain Sullivan shook her hand and wished her luck. Major Reynolds gave her that promised letter. Sergeant Mitchell simply nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Anna, Liesel, and Hilda would travel home with her, back to a Germany none of them recognized. But they would face it together, armed with the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could still be found, that enemies could show mercy, that rules and principles mattered. The transport truck that took them away looked exactly like the one that had brought them. But Greta was not the same woman who had arrived terrified 18 months earlier. She had learned that propaganda lies, that enemies are just people, that kindness is a choice. As the truck rolled through the camp gates for the last time, she looked back at Camp Florence. It had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a school, and the lessons she had learned there would shape the rest of her life. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel, give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. History has lessons to teach us, but only if we choose to listen.